Everyone for joining us today at this launch event for our new VoxDevLit. I'm Oliver Hannay, the managing editor here at VoxDev, and I'll be hosting today's session. We're super excited to be joined by Rachel Heath, who is the senior editor that was in charge of bringing together this VoxDevLit on female labour force participation. And we'd also like to thank the co-editors, Ariel Bernhardt, Girija Borka, Anne Fitzpatrick, Anthony Keats, Madeline McElway, Andreas Menzel, Teresa Molina, and Garima Sharma, as well as British International Investment for the funding that made this VoxDevLit possible. This VoxDevLit is part of our growing library of living literature reviews at VoxDev, which are available on our website. This is now our 11th living literature review, and these reviews summarise the key takeaways for policymakers from economic research on topics in development economics. We're super excited to be bringing a number of new reviews over the coming months, including on subjects such as public service delivery, foreign direct investment, taxes, student outcomes, and more. And the best way to keep up to date is by signing up to our newsletter through our website. Today's session is going to be a 40-minute presentation by Rachel, followed by 20 minutes or so for questions. You can submit these using the Q&A function on Zoom, and you can also vote on other people's questions if you want to see those answered, and I will pose these at the end during the Q&A. So without further ado, Rachel, I'll hand over to you.
Well, thank you so much, Oliver, and to you and to the rest of the VoxDev team for kind of setting up this literature review. And I'm very honored that you kind of asked me to participate. And I want to echo Oliver's thanks of my fantastic team of co-editors who have been really great. And thanks to all of you for being here. I'm really excited to have a chance to tell you about this work we've done. I'm just figuring out there we go, how to go forward. So to set the stage, I just want to kind of point out that women's labor force participation varies a lot throughout the world. So it's, never universal. There's, no part of the world are all women working, but it ranges from, kind of close to 70% in places like North America and East Asia and the Pacific, down to kind of two regions of the world that we'll talk a lot about today. South Asia is in the purple, and Middle East and North Africa is in the black, where women's labor force participation is much more uncommon. Less than 30% of women are working. And the other thing to kind of set the stage with this graph is to point out there's also been kind of different trends in the past roughly 30 years. So in some places in the world, women's labor supply has been increasing. You could see in the last couple of years, of course, there's been a COVID disruption, but some places women's labor supply has been increasing, and in other places, especially kind of places in the world where it's less common, it's actually been falling as well. And so we'll be talking about kind of some of these differential factors that depend on context that might be kind of driving this really big heterogeneity in women's labor supply. So why do we care about women's labor supply? Why have we kind of written this whole literature review on it? So I think there's kind of important benefits that start out at the household level, so that the opportunity to work makes women kind of more empowered within the household. And then it also impacts their children, and in particular the human capital investments in their children. And there's evidence that's especially true of girl children that might not otherwise get the same human capital investment that boy children do. So those are already important benefits, but if we kind of zoom out to the society-wide level, there's also really good evidence that women's labor force participation promotes overall economic growth, that it's just not the best thing for the country overall if, a lot of the kind of talent in the economy is wasted, kind of not able to participate to the fullest extent possible. So if we're thinking about, women's labor supply is important, what determines it? We can broadly divide the determinants of women's labor supply into two kind of sets of categories. The first is what we can call supply side. So those are factors that affect women's decision to participate in the workforce. And we can also kind of say, on the other hand, there's demand side factors. Those are factors that affect employers' decisions to hire female workers. So I want to kind of point out that there's not always a clear delineation between these factors. They kind of frequently interact with each other. So to just give one example, we'll talk about kind of, how one kind of factor that affects women's decision to work is the safety that they feel going to work and things like public transportation. So that's kind of broadly a supply side factor. But then I'll also mention some research that finds that employers are more likely to hire women when they know that women have a safe transportation option. So that kind of broadly fits kind of in the demand side. So there's that kind of interaction that employers are responding to the supply side factors that affect women. So there won't always be this clear delineation, but I think it's still kind of a broadly useful way to organize this talk. So kind of, what specifically will we talk about? So on the supply side, we'll start out by talking about fertility and childcare. We'll talk about kind of a closely related consideration, which is intra-household constraints on women working. We'll talk about norms kind of in society about women working. We'll talk about some psychological factors, about kind of internal kind of factors that promote women's work. As I mentioned, some external factors that are important are the safety and harassment that women feel in public and in their workplaces. And then we'll conclude the supply side by talking about workplace amenities, so the kinds of things that employers provide that may make work easier for women. So that's the supply side. Then we'll switch to the demand side and talk about potential discrimination that women might face from their employers, both at the time of hiring and in being promoted into managerial positions. We'll talk about education and skills and whether kind of increasing women's skills increases their labor supply. And then we'll conclude by talking broadly about the role of globalization in promoting women in the labor force. So to start out with, we'll talk about fertility and childcare. And so this graph shows in different regions of the world, how has women's labor supply, how does it correspond to fertility rates? And the point I want to make here is that in some parts of the world, you can see, for instance, the gray line is China, the orange line is Brazil. They're kind of, as fertility has fallen, women's labor supply has gone up, and that kind of, suggests that there is kind of a role for kind of fertility in higher rates of fertility in keeping women out of the labor force. In other parts of the world, however, it's much more flat, so that maybe there's a small relationship as fertility falls that women are more likely to work. But it's not as doesn't seem to be as big of a contributor. And there are even some parts of the world where it's totally flat, and it doesn't seem like there's a relationship between fertility and women's labor supply. So it seems that this kind of hugely context driven, and indeed some authors that have kind of looked at what are the kind of what are the contextual factors that affect whether falling rates of fertility kind of increase women's labor supply. And what looks like it matters is the level of economic development, so that at some kind of, some points in economic development, it's particularly important to, that fertility is reduced to enable women to work. But also the labor market structure, kind of a more demand side factor, matters as well. So that, what's really important is, are there kind of jobs that are interested in hiring women? So that's another important contextual factor. Another thing that's come out of this literature is that it's maybe not, kind of fertility, kind of every single birth matters similarly in kind of whether a woman works after that birth or not. There's evidence that what's particularly important for promoting women's labor supply is delaying her first birth. And so interventions that, such as birth control, that kind of delay women's first birth are particularly important in kind of making sure that they keep working with children. So that's kind of the overall rates of fertility. But another important thing is kind of who is caring for the children that do exist. So this figure here shows that as the gender gap in unpaid care work, so kind of work within the household that includes things like taking care of kids. So how much more do women do of that work compared to men is really strongly associated with lower rates of female labor force participation. So that, it kind of suggests that it's, not just about overall fertility, but about who's taking care of those kids that are born. And there is indeed good evidence that kind of children affect how women work and the kind of work that they do. So in particular, women kind of often bring children to work, which is associated with lower earnings. So kind of going back to that, that figure on the previous page, it may be that women, in some of those places where women, fertility doesn't affect whether women work, it's, that's true, but it might be affecting whether, how much they're earning. And there's, aside from kind of bringing children to work, it looks like women switch to different industries as they have children and are more likely to become self-employed compared to working for wages. And so that, those jobs are potentially more amenable to combining with their childcare duties at home, but they might not pay as much as other jobs. So given this kind of unequal burden of childcare that women face, it does suggest that the more childcare is available, the more likely that women are to work outside the home. And indeed, there's a recent meta-analysis that looked at a bunch of really well-done studies in low-income countries that estimate a causal impact of childcare and labor supply, either a randomized controlled trial or a natural experiment where we can kind of compare an area that got childcare to a plausible control group that didn't. And so it does, we do have really good evidence that if you give women childcare, they're more likely to work outside the home. And these studies tend to find effects on both what we call the extensive and the intensive margins, so that childcare both affects whether women work outside the home at all, but also the intensive margin, how many hours do they work? So it enables women to do things like go from part to full-time work. And kind of corresponding to some of those studies I mentioned on the previous page, it's not just that women are kind of more likely to, to kind of work at all. They're also earning more, so they're able to move into better paying jobs when they get access to childcare. So, what's the, how, if childcare is really important, what's the way that it can be provided, especially at scale? So the studies mentioned here are kind of smaller studies, are often smaller studies, kind of in a type of a pilot setting. But there are some recent successes of what's called community organized childcare. A study in the Dominican Republic of the Congo and in Burkina Faso found that childcare programs that are originated in the community and are organized and run by the community had these similar effects as far as increasing women's labor supply. So it looks like that's an effective way to provide childcare that has these important effects. So moving on, and as I mentioned, a closely related set of constraints to childcare is the role of kind of any sort of intra-household disagreement on whether women work. And that's particularly an important constraint because there is really good evidence that in low-income countries, men are less likely than women to support a woman's right to work outside the home. So this figure here quotes or cites kind of in different countries in the world that are listed in the bottom. They surveyed men and women and asked, do you agree with the statement women should have the freedom to work outside the home? And in the high-income countries on the right here, there is essentially the same rate of agreement by men and women, and it's almost universal that people think that women have that right. But if we look in certain low-income countries over here on the left, there's really big gaps. It's common that women think, yes, a vast majority of women think that that women should be able to work outside the home, but support by men is much lower, and kind of almost half of men in several of these countries say, you know, women shouldn't have the freedom to work outside the home. So with that backdrop, it is plausible that, you know, that kind of men are, you know, in particular husbands, are a constraint to women working outside the home. So how can women's labor supply be increased in this context? You know, one way is to increase the bargaining power that that women have in their home. And indeed, there's a couple of recent studies that have found that empowering women can increase their labor supply. They're both set in India, and it's different ways of empowering women. So in the Field et al. Program, they studied an experiment that deposited women's earnings from a public works program into an account that's in their name. And that led to women working more, both for that program and outside of it. And in a recent paper I had, we looked at women gaining inheritance rights. They're more likely to work outside the home too, which was kind of a, you know, surprising finding in light of the fact that we think that kind of getting a big, you know, kind of getting a big inheritance in the future makes you wealthier, might make you less likely to work. But actually, counter to that, women kind of, you know, it kind of empowered women to know they had this transfer coming in, and it actually made them more likely to work outside the home. So that's, you know, that's kind of looks like one promising way to increase women's labor supply. But a recent paper by Lowe and McElway finds that, you know, it's complicated. So what they did was they ran an experiment where they kind of gave information about jobs to men versus women. And in one of the treatments, they encouraged them to talk about the job. And so that actually led to lower rates of women working, suggesting that, you know, that kind of certain treatments can actually just kind of reinforce the current power dynamic in the household, and kind of let men have kind of what the authors call veto power over women working. The other option in this setting would be to try to target men and kind of, you know, target those attitudes that were leading so many men to say that women shouldn't have the freedom to work outside the home. In another paper by Maddie McElway, who's, as you might remember, is one of the co-editors, she did an experiment where a bunch of women were offered jobs with a carpet manufacturer in India. In the treatment group, the families, their husband and their parent-in-laws, got a video that were kind of meant to kind of assuage some of their concerns about working. You know, kind of, is it unsafe? Will they still be able to do their household responsibilities? So that, you know, that treatment did increase women's labor supply. So it suggests that you can bring family members on board to get women to work by kind of changing their perceptions of work. But the after a year, the treated women were didn't have this big kind of increase in working. And her explanation is that when women started working, it didn't reduce the amount of work that they were doing in the house. And so, ultimately they found it too hard to continue working, even with their family members on board. So it suggests that kind of in the presence of these kind of other constraints, unequal division of labor, that kind of ultimately was the deciding factor. Another recent paper targeted adolescent boys to change their attitude. And they kind of received a training that tried to kind of liberalize their gender attitudes. And it actually did change their behavior. They were doing more household chores. And these authors are planning a long-term follow-up as these boys kind of, become adults and get married, to see, did this lead to kind of a long-lasting change that can be observed in their future households. So we look forward to covering that in a kind of future iteration of the literature review. So turning to norms, which is kind of closely related to these inter-household constraints, kind of why are so many men against women working? There's evidence that norms are really kind of have really long-lasting impacts on labor supply. And one way that we know that is, for instance, that when immigrants move to a different country, immigrants that come from a country where women are less likely to be working they're less likely to be working. The second generation is less likely to be working compared to immigrants from places where women are more likely to be working, even when they're all in the same setting. So it's not about their current setting. It looks like it's something kind of from the past that followed them. And indeed, these norms have really deep-seated roots. So you can kind of trace them back to kind of pre-industrial farming practices that can explain in areas where plows were more common, that required a lot of upper body strength. So women weren't involved in the as much in agricultural in those pre-industrial stages. Even fast forwarding today, women in those areas or in ethnic groups that come from those areas are less likely to be working. So that kind of, that organization of society persisted even once societies are no longer practicing that kind of pre-industrial agriculture. So, they're deep-seated, but at the same time, in a paper by Ariel Bernhardt, which is another one of our co-editors, they pointed out that norms can evolve as well. So she looked in the Indian setting and found that kind of if you're Hindu and you're kind of deciding whether to adhere to the purity norms around caste, that can kind of be explained by, are you around more people that are kind of not part of this system and where women are more liberalized, so that kind of exposure to that external factor was also affecting norms. So can norms be changed in a way that kind of enables more women to work? So when we just discussed these two studies that show that you can think about ways to target men to try to change their attitudes around women's work. Another promising effect points out that even though I showed you evidence that, men are less likely than women in low-income countries to support women's working, that men still underestimate the support of other men for women's work. That, in every country surveyed, still over half of the women thought that over half of the men thought that women should have the freedom to work. And, these studies point out that it's more common that men think, basically no men think women should work. And so that one promising intervention is correcting those misperceptions, telling men, did you know actually that, most men do think women should be able to work? And that actually did increase women's labor supply. So that looks promising. Another promising intervention is that working itself. So in the paper by Field et al. That kind of prompted women's labor supply by putting their earnings in an account that was in their own name. Remember, that led to more women working. Several years later, they went back and found that there was also more support for women working in these areas. So the very act of women working kind of led more people to be in favor of women's work. And this paper by Ho et al. Found that, again, kind of if you kind of prompt women to work, in this case, it was by offering them jobs that were more flexible, just kind of working itself led women to be more amenable to working in the future. So it can kind of change women's own attitudes. So this creates a potential for what can be called a virtuous cycle, that if you have an intervention, including some of the ones we've been discussing here today, that can prompt women to work, that can change the norms around women's working or the perceptions of whether women can and should work, which can further increase labor supply, and you get this kind of compounding effect. So that last paper is a good segue into thinking about kind of psychological constraints to women's working, kind of more kind of internal type constraints. So kind of in a couple of papers have looked at kind of aspirations and kind of can changing aspirations affect women's labor supply. And so this Orkin et al. Paper, it's kind of a relatively short workshop, a one-time thing that was designed to kind of raise women's aspirations, but still keep them within reach, reasonable. So that one-time workshop, when they went back 17 months later, women were more likely to be working. So that had a lasting impact. Interestingly, they also had a treatment arm that just gave a cash grant to women. And in that arm, there was no additional role of this workshop. So the way the authors interpret this is that giving cash can also raise aspirations, which suggests that, kind of overall economic development might be kind of playing an important role as well in kind of increasing women's aspirations. The Ahmed et al. Paper had kind of a similar treatment meant to kind of increase women's aspirations by kind of showing relatable women who worked. And around kind of 18 months later, so a similar time frame as the other paper, they found that women were more likely to be working. And this was at the start of the COVID-19 pandemic. But interestingly, there was no effect earlier. It took the COVID pandemic to actually kind of increase women's labor supply. And what these authors suggest is that they're kind of, aspirations are important, but there might be kind of a complementary role of kind of what's called push factors. In this case, many of their husbands were, and other male family members were losing jobs, that kind of, you needed that higher aspirations and kind of a nudge to get into the labor market. But when that happened, they were more likely to be working. There's some work on other psychological factors. The generalized efficacy, the kind of belief in one's ability to reach goals, can increase labor supply. But similarly to Maddie's other work, again, the effects faded after 1 year. So it suggests that you kind of also need to address some of these other constraints to women's labor supply. So there's kind of a potential for kind of a workshop that emphasizes mental imagery to kind of visualize outcomes in your mind's eye, and an experiment that run by Ashraf and al. That kind of looked at women entrepreneurs in Colombia who were assigned to this visualization treatment did actually have higher profits. So again, that kind of psychological motivation to kind of envision your future and your profits was effective. Kind of a closely related psychological constraint is treatment for mental illness, and in particular for depression. In this paper by Baranoff et al. That focused on kind of recent mothers in Pakistan that were kind of classified as depressed, it increased their financial empowerment. They kind of had positive effects for labor supply, but they were too noisy to really be able to say much. And one of their points is that labor supply in this population in a country where women are less likely to work, among new mothers, is really low anyway, and so it's hard to kind of see what was going on. And this treatment wasn't sufficient to get large numbers of women into the labor force. There was a similar finding in India that kind of depression treatment didn't, kind of increase women's labor supply. And again, suggesting that in the presence of all these other constraints, that kind of, just treating the depression wasn't enough. So turning now to safety and harassment in the workplace and in public. To kind of set the stage in this area, women are exposed to harassment in many different areas. So, in school, large numbers of, these are just some examples. Our report cites kind of a lot more evidence. But, in school, a lot of adolescents have suffered sexual harassment. In public spaces, kind of the vast majority of women in many countries have been subjected to kind of harassment in public spaces. And at work as well. So in some work in garment factories in Bangladesh, non-trivial numbers of garment workers were, even in kind of a large, well-respected exporting firm, were, kind of subject to threats, physical harassment, and sexual harassment. So, there is evidence that this harassment does constrain women's choices. So, violence in school, I kind of put the qualifier here, sometimes affects school enrollment. So there's, in some context, it looks like they're, girls that have experienced harassment and violence in schools are less likely to be enrolled. In other contexts, it doesn't look like there's that effect, which goes back to this this idea that there might be other really big constraints, kind of obligations that those girls have in their households that are keeping them out of school, regardless of the harassment that they face. In a paper by our co-editor Garija Borger, she looked at women's choices of college in Delhi, India, and that women kind of, if you look at the different routes that they can take to colleges, women, if their route to a higher quality college was less safe, women are less likely to go there. And men didn't have nearly the same effects. It was kind of a particular constraint. The safety on public transit was a particular constraint for women. This is a paper from Sweden, but I think it has a general lesson for low-income countries that experiencing harassment in the workplace prompts women to take a pay cut, to do things like switch to another employer or kind of be less likely to seek internal promotion. So that's kind of an impact in the workplace as well. So what can be done to address harassment? There are some studies that look effective. So you can increase school principal skills around managing violence. You can increase the awareness of students about the negative consequences of harassment and help them report incidents. And in the college level, a recent paper looked at sexual harassment training in the context of a class that was also effective at reducing harassment. In public transportation, there's some evidence that, kind of given that women do face harassment on public transportation, that just making public transportation faster and more efficient kind of helps already, just minimizing the exposure to those risks. There's some evidence that women-only cars are effective, and that police patrols that are kind of specifically instructed to target sexual harassment are also effective at reducing the harassment women face. In workplaces, kind of again, another study from the high-income country setting found that women as managers are more likely to fire perpetrators of violence. So getting women into managerial roles is an important step there. How can that be done? There's this kind of reinforcing effect that having sexual harassment training for managers actually increases the number of women managers. So that's kind of, that's one way already to get women into the managerial roles. So our last supply side factor, which relates to a lot of these constraints that we've talked about, kind of, can employers have a role of alleviating those constraints, is to think about workplace amenities. What are the kinds of workplace amenities that look like women particularly value? So one was flexibility, kind of related to the childcare constraints, kind of maternity leave, and childcare also matter. Safety at work is something that increases women's labor supply, given the harassment that we just discussed, and kind of making commute safer is something that employers can do. A couple other things that haven't come up yet is that women seem to value working with other women, and kind of more generally having kind of dignity and voice at work. These are things that, when employers do provide them, women are more likely to be working. But at the same time, throughout the world, it's kind of a common factor that these are relatively rare. And which is kind of surprising, given that some evidence we cite in the report that it can be profitable for employers to provide some of these amenities, that they actually pay for themselves as far as kind of a broader set of workers and better employee retention. In work by Garija Sharma, which is another of our co-editors, what she pointed out is the fact that, kind of relatively few employers do provide these benefits gives them what's called monopsony power. It means that kind of, women just have fewer choices of places to work, and it means that employers can get away with paying women less because they have a reduced choice set. Okay, so how can we prompt employers to promote female-friendly amenities? So one way is for just the government to come in and, especially things like childcare, that's kind of, that likely is going to be a role for the government in providing those amenities. In another paper by Garima and co-authors, they looked at kind of a role for unions in providing these. And so they studied a reform in Brazil that kind of prompted the big labor union to prioritize women's needs in collective bargaining. And so, women who worked in employers that were affected, whose unions were affected by this reform, that, they did want to go work there. And, it came kind of without any negative consequences, no lower wages for women or men, no lower rates of employment, or no lower firm profits. So again, it kind of suggests that this is something employers could do that women could value, and, it won't kind of hurt their bottom line. So it's really a win-win. Some work that including papers that I've done has looked at, in export industries, there's a role for international buyers to kind of prompt their, the suppliers that they're buying from to follow labor standards. Might that lead to kind of a reduction in employment, if it's more costly to hire workers because you have to adhere to standards? One paper found yes, so that kind of better standards did come at the expense of total employment. But in other cases, and these are both in the garment industry in Bangladesh, there wasn't that trade-off. So it suggested that if employers did have kind of monopsony power, as we were just discussing, that there is a role for kind of prompting employers to kind of improve overall working conditions and total compensation, and that doesn't always come at the expense of jobs. So that's kind of an optimistic finding. There's some evidence also that kind of firms themselves, if you kind of can nudge them to provide these amenities, then then that is effective as well. This particular paper by Kuhn and Shen looked at a reform that kind of disallowed firms to from kind of requesting workers of a specific gender. And so what they found is that kind of so-called match quality, the quality of workers they were getting, improved. So they needed to be prompted to kind of stop looking at only one gender, but once they did, they were getting better workers. So kind of prompting more firms to do that would kind of benefit them as well. So turning to the demand side and starting with discrimination that women might face. So it is plausible that employers do have preferences for workers of certain genders. So this graph here shows that countries that are kind of poorer on the left here are people are more likely to agree that men make better business executives than women do. And that corresponds with a lot of evidence that I cite here, that it is common for employers to kind of request applicants of a specific gender. And so, and kind of corresponding to this kind of belief about women's ability, when they ask for women participants or women applicants in particular, they're targeted for lower paid and less prestigious positions. So what can be done? So if there is an affirmative action policy in place, there's a study that found that informing applicants of this policy was effective at increasing women applying. Improved safety can reduce what this paper calls paternalistic discrimination, that the Buchman et al. Paper, that they found that employers were less likely to hire women if they didn't think that they had a safe ride home. And so kind of if they were told that, women do have a safe ride home, they were more likely to hire them for jobs. So that kind of infrastructure investment kind of reduced discrimination. As far as getting women into managerial positions, there's a study that found that people are less less likely to follow the advice of leaders that are women. But a way to reduce that gap was to tell participants in this study, how competent the leaders were. And so that made them trust women. So getting more information out there can be effective. In this study that's also in the Bangladeshi garment industry by Rocco Macchiavello and co-authors, they worked with firms to promote men and women and kind of randomized where they went within the factory. So the women that were kind of newly supervisors did initially have lower productivity, and that was led by kind of lines where there were a lot of men that kind of were doubtful of their ability. But there's a kind of an optimistic story at the end here, is that kind of eventually workers were more open to have female supervisors. So, and that kind of period of initial lower productivity was kind of faded away, so that kind of just having the experience with women leaders was important. Thinking about education and skills, I'm just going to kind of briefly kind of go over, we in the report, we kind of go over a lot of really well done studies, but I'll just kind of, in the interest of time, give you the kind of the punchline here. The theory here is that, kind of increasing human capital, which could be through formal schooling or vocational or entrepreneurship training, can lead, can kind of lead to higher potential earnings if you do work, which, plausibly does lead to increased labor force participation. But, as we've just been discussing all of these supply side constraints, there might kind of, in the presence of those other constraints, they might be, keeping women from working, even if they really have good skills. And indeed, there's evidence that kind of job training programs are more effective in areas where women's labor supply is already high, where there are fewer of these other kind of constraints to women's works. And so among these studies that we find, there's kind of mixed effects. So I don't want to imply that, there's never effects. Sometimes you find positive effects, other times you don't. And that kind of fits with this idea that, that it's very context specific, and, you kind of need an area where, women have kind of a relatively unconstrained in working, and, the only constraint there is or the main constraint is skills. When that happens, there is an effect, and other times that's, in the presence of these other effects, that's why we're probably not seeing big effects of training programs. So the last factor I'll talk about before just briefly concluding is globalization. So there is evidence that this chart shows kind of how much exports increased in a period of globalization between 1995 and 2005, and kind of how much does employment go up. And what we see is that women's work, which is in orange, is increasing with globalization. You see this kind of slight upward slope in the line. It's not drastic, so it suggests that there are other kind of determinants of women's labor supply, which are all the things we've been talking about. But the fact that it's kind of going up with globalization suggests that, globalization is one more factor. The same wasn't true for men. So, but, amidst that kind of overall kind of tendency for women to be working, there's kind of here also important heterogeneity that kind of, when tariffs are reduced, that also hurts industries that import, even as it helps exporting industries. And in certain contexts, as kind of importing industries are hurt, that can actually increase kind of gender gaps in labor force participation. That's been found in China and Peru, although the opposite was true in Brazil. That kind of hurt men more, and so it actually kind of closed the gender labor force participation gap. So, it suggests there are other factors here, which is both kind of, are women in the sectors of work that are more heavily affected, and, or kind of within a sector, are women doing the kinds of tasks that are, that are kind of cut when there's increased competition. Another kind of important factor here is that kind of when in India, when tariffs were reduced, in industries where kind of there was a lot of concentration, so that they had kind of enjoyed monopoly power before the reduction, economic theory says that should actually decrease gender wage gaps, because you can no longer get away with kind of, kind of being discriminatory. This is kind of forcing efficiency. But they actually found the opposite being true, and they suggest this is kind of due to kind of lower enforcement of labor standards, and women's bargaining power were kind of important contextual factors there. So let me just briefly conclude to make sure we have time for questions. So we've kind of gone over a lot of different constraints for women's labor supply, and we identify there's kind of, several kind of programs that we think are kind of, have pretty consistently positive impacts. So, childcare ability, increased empowering women within households, kind of psychological interventions can be really effective. Anything that kind of prompts business to offer amenities like flexibility that women value. and increased globalization if it affects the kinds of industries that disproportionately hire women. We also pointed out that there's some programs that have mixed impacts. Not always, not always positive, not negative either. But those are things like skills training or depression treatment that are probably not enough to overcome other barriers if women's labor supply is already low. Then there are other programs that we kind of gave you, we told you about the evidence that exists, but that we kind of identify are particularly important areas for, for there to be more evidence. Kind of addressing discrimination, improving safety, or kind of particularly open areas for research, as well as, among these successful interventions that we mention, there's of course kind of more research needed and kind of the best ways to provide those interventions. So I'll stop now and take questions. Thanks, everybody.
Great. Thanks so much, Rachel. That was such an interesting presentation. So I think I'll give 2 questions at a time, and then while you're answering, I'll go through and find a couple more to ask. So the first from Vivek asks about whether there's any evidence on how the provision of amenities interacts with formality. So he gives the example of if informal jobs provide more flexibility, might that incentivize women to disproportionately enter these informal jobs, which themselves might have fewer labor protections? And then Diana asks about whether there was any kind of evidence or specific studies regarding WASH infrastructure at work. So kind of particularly thinking about the provision of appropriate facilities for menstruation at work or other kind of related factors, and if that's something that there was any evidence on.
Yeah, 2 great questions to start. So thanks for those. On the first one, so I do think there is evidence that we kind of cited the switch from wage to self-employment that does come with children, and I do think those self-employment jobs are less likely to be formal. So I think that is happening. So, but the kind of some of the studies we cited about flexibility were about whether there's a way to kind of put a measure of flexibility in the formal sector jobs so that women are able to kind of enjoy some of the benefits from formality, official contracts and those legal rights, and still have some degree of flexibility, because we know that, we know that a lot of what's happening otherwise is kind of indeed kind of choosing flexibility, even if it's informal. On the kind of WASH question, I think I actually know one of our co-editors, Andres Manciel, is working on this, so we'll make sure to fit that into a kind of a future version of iteration of this literature review. I mean, I think kind of broadly, it is something that that some of these projects in particular in the garment industry that we were citing that kind of try to improve overall working conditions, those things that are kind of prompted by the buyers. Those do include kind of, safe and hygienic restrooms as well. They kind of typically come as part of a kind of a package of kind of improved working conditions, but, it looks like those are important, yeah, even if we kind of don't have yet the kind of, the specific evidence on the WASH facilities at work.
Great, thanks. So a couple of other questions. We have a question from Develina who asks about whether globalization might also have secondary effects by shifting norms around women's work, in addition to just kind of changing the demand for labor from different sections. And then Sophie asked about the impact of information and kind of the impact of incorrect beliefs about the labor market, and whether that has kind of a gender dimension as well, in terms of kind of impacts on women's labor force participation.
Yeah, so I think globalization, I mean, kind of given that there is that kind of, there is that tendency that, not everywhere, but kind of on average, globalization does prompt more women to work. And if you combine that with the evidence that we discussed, that kind of women working actually does change norms around women working, I think that actually is a very plausible story that kind of, that can kind of compound those effects, those initial effects of globalization. It's not just about the jobs, it's about kind of, changing it's about kind of changing their perceptions of those jobs. And I'll also flag a paper by Teresa Molina, another of the co-editors, who kind of found that when kind of it is about globalization per se. They studied garment factories in Myanmar, where kind of suddenly the country opened up and they got the opportunity to start exporting, and that kind of changed the quality of the jobs, and that led to kind of women being more empowered within their households. And I think plausibly that could kind of shift norms as well. So I think there is indeed evidence that it's about the globalization per se that's that is kind of has the potential to change things. On kind of the misperceptions, so the paper we cited by Bernstein et al. That was kind of it was set in Saudi Arabia, and it did target men. So in particular, there was indeed this evidence that kind of men in particular kind of were underestimating how much support there was for women's work. If I'm remembering, I don't know of any study that's kind of targeted men's versus women's misperceptions in the work context. There have been other studies that kind of just look at kind of providing information to men versus women on things like maternal mortality. Does that affect fertility? And I know those kind of studies often do find in particular that it really is men that have the misperceptions. So that's the kind of closest that I can think of.
Great. So we have a bunch more questions, so I'll ask two more. We have a question from Wei, who asks about whether there's kind of any key differences in the effectiveness of interventions by age group. For example, is there kind of things that seem particularly effective for a younger woman versus older woman? And is there any kind of promising interventions for a younger woman, but that don't really have much evidence base at the moment? And then we have another question by Salma, who asks about kind of thinking about how female labour force participation varies based on education levels, and says that, for example, in Jordan, there's kind of multiple studies showing that the reason behind low female labour force participation for women with low levels of education is more to do with social norms, but then for higher educated women, it's more about kind of the lack of jobs, especially in the private sector. So kind of even within a country, there's these different factors for different types of women in terms of their education. So I guess, yeah, if you have any comments on that.
Yeah, let's see. Oh, and so the first one, the second one was so interesting. Now, remind me the first one.
Yeah, it was about basically the effectiveness of interventions at different age groups.
Oh, ages. Yes. Yes. Thanks for both of those questions. Yeah. So on the ages, I mean, I think it is a really interesting question, and yeah, it's not that common to kind of have kind of explicitly effects broken down by different ages. I mean, I think kind of course, things that are operating on fertility are likely to, to indeed kind of impact younger women in particular, just kind of, based on, who's having kids. So I think that, that those probably are kind of, particularly effective in younger children, in younger women, even if we kind of, don't have kind of papers explicitly making that comparison. As for the question about kind of, are there kind of impacts on or kind of promising interventions that we don't have the evidence on, I'd say yeah. So there are kind of there are a series of papers that have looked at kind of ways of empowering adolescent girls through kind of teaching negotiation skills, kind of, safe spaces to, kind of build social capital with other girls. Or kind of interventions that say, delay marriage by paying, families to, to not marry their girls off, or early. And I think, these studies, those kind of cohorts of young women are now kind of entering the stages where they're, kind of deciding, are they still, working with, after they have children. And so I think we are going to kind of see the longer term impacts, can you kind of see those kind of, lasting into their adulthood. So I think we will be getting a lot more evidence on that. As far as kind of, labor supply by education, I think, it definitely kind of fits with this evidence that we presented that kind of when we look at reforms that have increased women's education levels, sometimes those increase labor supply and other times they don't. So it definitely is kind of consistent with that, the story that the question asker was kind of mentioning in Jordan, that, you can kind of, create a cohort of more educated women that don't always, they're not always more likely to work. And kind of as far as kind of how to kind of think about the kind of lack of jobs in the context that we that we've kind of laid out here. I mean, that kind of that could kind of fit with one of these kind of demand side factors that we talked about. Are kind of employers, they're there, but they don't want to hire women. Is it a discrimination story? Or maybe it kind of interacts with the supply side factors on kind of job amenities. So, maybe there are jobs, but they don't kind of, they aren't desirable to women because they don't provide the amenities we listed. So I think that kind of certainly kind of fits with the framework that we've laid out.
Thank you. I think we're gonna end now. I know that there's a lot of kind of unanswered questions in the Q&A tab, but I will make a note of all of these afterwards, and then we can bear them in mind if there's anything that is interesting or that we might want to include in a future iteration of the lit, then we will make sure that we've got a record of all the questions. Thank you again, Rachel, for your amazing presentation, and thank you to all the participants today who asked a lot of interesting questions. I've put a link in the chat to where you can read and download the full VoxDevLit, which I'm sure might answer some of the questions that you've had. And we'll also make a recording of this event available on our website, as well as the slides. I know some people were asking about if the slides were available, so yeah, they'll be on our website as well. So yeah, thank you everyone, and stay tuned to hear about what other VoxDevLits we have in the works.